Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Nursing Advocacy on Clean Air Standards for Particulate Matter. My name is Kara Cook, and I'm the Climate and Health Program Manager with the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. As nurses, we know how important clean air is to human health. Recently, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency announced that they will be retaining the current National Ambient Air Quality Standards for Particulate Matter, or PM. Health and environmental groups have long advocated that the current PM standard should be strengthened as it does not adequately protect public health. On decisions such as this one, the public has an opportunity to weigh in. And in this instance, nurses can do that either by providing oral testimony at a virtual public hearing or submitting written comments. It's so important that EPA hears from nurses on why setting strong limits of dangerous air pollutants is critical for health. First, this webinar will provide an overview of how particulate matter harms health and provide some background information on the regulatory process for the development of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for PM. Then we'll delve deeper into the details of the virtual hearing, review the process of speaking at the public hearing, and share how you can submit comments via regulations.gov. This webinar is meant to help guide you through the process, whether you are a seasoned advocate or someone who'll be providing testimony for the first time. And we're going to have ample time for you all to ask questions after the presentations. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Laura K. Bender, who's the National Assistant Vice President of Healthy Air at the American Lung Association. Laura K. has spent nearly a decade working for protections from air pollution and climate change. In her role at the American Lung Association, she leads the Healthy Air campaign, directing advocacy initiatives in Washington, D.C. So with that, I'll turn it over to Laura K.
Thank you, and hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being on this webinar. Thank you to Annie for having me to speak. I'm just so grateful to everyone who's willing to take the time as a volunteer to share their personal experiences as nurses and other health professionals and their expertise to help try and push EPA to set stronger standards on a pollutant that really needs them. So I'll give a quick overview of particle pollution, some of the health impacts, how we're doing as a country with regard to cleaning up this pollutant, and then how EPA's process, is supposed to work and then is working right now. And if this is elementary for folks, please forgive me in advance. I'm happy to answer specific questions in the Q&A section. So first off, particle pollution is one of the most widespread types of air pollution in the US. When we talk about particles, they are bits of things, essentially. They can be solids or liquids or aerosols, but essentially tiny bits of stuff that are particularly harmful as they get smaller. There's a couple different kinds of particle pollution that we talk about, PM10 and PM2.5. PM10 is sometimes called coarse particle pollution. It's a little bit bigger. Dust and pollen are examples of coarse PM. You can see on the diagram that there is still about a fifth of the width of a human hair. PM2.5 is what I'll be talking about today. These are fine particles, and these are more dangerous. Basically, the smaller in size a particle is, the greater risk it has of penetrating deep into the lungs and sometimes even into the bloodstream. So finer particles tend to be more dangerous than coarse particles. And this, our work on this hearing is really to, and in this comment period, is to push EPA to strengthen its standards for fine particle pollution. So what are the health risks? A whole slate of them, and I'll talk about vulnerable populations in a minute, but generally speaking, particles cause premature death. They can also cause asthma attacks and other breathing problems, heart attacks and strokes, again, because they can even penetrate the bloodstream with their small size. People with existing lung and heart disease can find their conditions worsen. The World Health Organization has determined that particle pollution causes lung cancer. And there's some emerging evidence that links particles to low birth weight and infant mortality as well. Essentially, the science on particle pollution, particularly fine particles, is evolving, but as the years have gone by, we've seen that these particles are more dangerous than we previously thought and at lower levels than we previously thought, which I'll talk more about later. In terms of where these come from, So particles are sometimes emitted directly from sources of pollution. Sometimes they're formed when other emissions react in the atmosphere. But generally speaking, things like diesel exhaust from trucks, emissions from our cars and other vehicles on and off road, power plants and other industrial sources, and then fires, including wildfires, are big sources of PM in the US. And then in terms of at greater risk, at the Lung Association, we like to say that someone in every family is more at risk from the health impacts of air pollution. Of course, babies, children, and teens are particularly vulnerable because their lungs are still developing. They also tend to inhale more air per unit of body weight. Older adults are more vulnerable to health impacts of PM and other air pollutants. People with chronic diseases, again, because exposure to these air pollutants can worsen symptoms. So having asthma, COPD, heart disease, or lung cancer can also put you at greater risk. And then people of color. So what we found this year is that EPA has, and we'll talk more about this process in a minute, but EPA's own science advisors have concluded that populations of color, I think their specific wording was non-white populations, are at increased risk from exposure to air pollution due to a number of factors. Former smokers, as well as current smokers, face increased risk from the health impacts of air pollution. Healthy adults can also, on levels when days when levels are high enough or with a long enough exposure, they can also suffer health impacts. But working or exercising outdoors, especially near sources of particle pollution, such as major roads, can certainly exacerbate that risk. And then finally, people with low incomes, because low-income populations often live closer to sources of pollution, and then there's a lot of confounding factors with regard to medical care and lack of access. I'll take a minute here to say that last month, the American Lung Association released our annual State of the Air report. This report uses EPA's data to look at levels of particle pollution as well as ozone across the country. So one thing that I find helpful when I'm drafting comments for EPA is to look up my local air quality to be able to say that I live in an area that has unhealthy levels of a pollutant, if that's the case. So I want to invite folks, if it's useful to you, to go to lung.org/SOTA, and you can actually look up the particle pollution levels in your county. You can also see if the city or metro area where you live is among those that have the highest levels of particle pollution. I also share this report because it gives a snapshot of where we are as a country in terms of particles. So what we found in this year's State of the Air report is that most of the cities with the most particle pollution got worse. We measure that in two ways, and so does EPA. So there's spikes in particle pollution, which of course can be dangerous because if levels are high enough at a given time, they can cause immediate health impacts. And there's also annual particle pollution, so the day in, day out levels that you're breathing. That's also harmful because long-term exposure to even lower levels of particle pollution can cause health problems. So what we found in this year's State of the Air report is that 22 of the 25 most polluted cities by spikes in particle pollution had more days that were unhealthy to breathe than they did in last year's report. Unfortunately, we are able to say that that is largely a product of climate change. Climate change, of course, makes the conditions for wildfires more likely. And the report this year covered the devastating wildfires that occurred in the West in 2017 and 2018. And we really saw that show up in the spikes and dangerous levels of particle pollution. I think the lesson here this teaches us is that EPA standards are more important than ever, knowing that climate change continues to put people at greater risk of conditions that can lead to more particle pollution. I also mentioned that there's a second measure of particles that EPA looks at and that we look at in our report, which is the annual day in, day out level. The news here was more mixed, a little worse than last year's report, but generally speaking, we still saw that the wildfires were so bad that they even showed up in some of the annual averages for PM in some of the Western cities. So now I'll take a minute to talk through what EPA's process is around these standards. So particle pollution is covered by the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, NAAQS for short, catchy name, I know. These are standards that cover 6 total pollutants, so particle pollution is just one of them. And this is, we like to say it's the heart and lungs of the Clean Air Act. So the Clean Air Act lays out these requirements for these standards, and the beauty of them is that the standards have to be set at what's safe to breathe. We like to say at the American Lung Association that just like you wouldn't want a doctor diagnosing you based on what your disease might cost to treat, you want to know what you have and then come up with a treatment plan. That's how the National Ambient Air Quality Standards work too. Under the Clean Air Act, EPA is required to look at the science and then set those national standards at the level requisite to protect public health with a margin of safety. So they need to look at what's actually safe to breathe, accounting for the fact that some people are more vulnerable than others, and set the level to the point where they're able to breathe safely. I mentioned earlier that the science on particle pollution has evolved. The beauty is the Clean Air Act also provides for that too. Under the law, EPA is supposed to periodically review the National Ambient Air Quality Standards every 5 years, take a look at the science, and if it shows that the standards are now out of date with what we know is necessary to protect health, they have to update them. This process generally works. I will say that EPA almost never meets its 5-year deadline. In fact, the Lung Association has sued Democratic and Republican administrations to get them to meet this deadline. But generally speaking, EPA every several years reviews the science, and with particle pollution, they've continually found that, again, particles are more dangerous in more ways and at lower levels than they previously knew. And so that's led to the standards getting tightened over time. The good news is that the implementation part of this is what's actually led to dramatic cleanup. So that standard, the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, is what communities across the country have to work to meet. So what happens is once EPA sets that standard, they finalize it into law. They then work with the states to monitor for their levels of particle pollution or whatever the pollutant is. And if a state is, or if an area is found to not be meeting the standard, EPA declares them to be in non-attainment, and the state has to write a cleanup plan and then actually implement it to get to the point where levels are safe to breathe. This has dramatically reduced particle pollution over the years. So we have seen dramatic increases in technology that allow us to control pollution. We've seen reductions in emissions from vehicles, industry, power plants. We've seen old, dirty diesel trucks retired, fleets switch over to cleaner forms of vehicles, retirement of old power plants and other industrial sources. And I point this out especially to say this year is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Air Act. So it's a chance to say, we have really seen the law work. When it's implemented the way it's supposed to be, the law is doing a great job at dramatically driving down these emissions that form deadly particle pollution. Now, of course, as we saw with our State of the Air report results, climate change is making that a little bit harder. One other important thing to know about these national ambient air quality standards is that they inform the air quality index. So this may look familiar to folks. This is basically how EPA translates the numerical levels of air pollution to what people should do. So folks have seen this. You can get a daily air quality forecast at airnow.gov. It's also often incorporated into weather forecasts. EPA uses monitors all over the country to give the public daily recommendations on how the air quality is with regard to their health. So for example, if a combination of ozone and particle pollution is making it an orange day, I, as a person with asthma, might use that information to avoid exercising outside that day. This is really important because the fact that the National Ambient Air Quality Standard is supposed to reflect the science means that this air quality index does the same thing. So if the standard is set to a level that actually reflects what's safe to breathe, then great news, the recommendations will flow from that. But if the standard is out of date, as it is right now, and is not accurately showing how much of a pollutant is safe to breathe, it means that potentially people using the air quality index could have a day when it's not safe for them to breathe and not even know it. I mentioned earlier that the process has not necessarily worked the way it's supposed to this time around. So a couple of things I'll say. So of course, the reason that we're having this conversation today is because EPA is in the midst of reviewing and taking action on its particle pollution standards. Now, rather than propose to update the standards, they have proposed keeping them the same. And I'll talk more about what we know about why that's so harmful for health in a minute. But I'll say here that they've also followed a process that is not conducive to using the best science to inform policy. They have rushed the review of the standards. They've tried to compress a process that normally takes years into several months. They also eliminated a key expert advisory panel. So historically, EPA has relied on experts, including many in the health community, to help comb through all of the research around particle pollution to be able to say whether the standards are adequate or not. EPA eliminated this panel this time around and then replaced it with an adequate substitute that did not allow for the same level of scientific input. So as I mentioned, the result is that EPA has officially proposed retaining the current standards for fine particulate matter. Now the stage of the process that they're in is taking public comments, including from you all, and then they'll take that input into account, hopefully, and then they'll decide what level to finalize into law, and that will lock in those standards for the next several years, most likely. Okay, so what are the current standards and what do we want? So the current annual limit is 12 micrograms per cubic meter. That is that particular measurement. So I mentioned those two types of the ways we measure particles. The annual limit, again, is the day in, day out levels of particle pollution that we deem to be safe to breathe over the long term. The limit is 12. This is actually even weaker than the Lung Association called for last time they updated the standards in 2012. And the evidence has only gotten stronger since then that it's not sufficient to protect public health. So there's some recent US and Canadian studies that found evidence of premature deaths with levels at, or in some cases below 8 micrograms per cubic meter. That is why we're recommending 8 micrograms per cubic meter for that annual limit. EPA also did an examination of some of the country to project out what the potential benefits to health might be of a stronger standard. They used the number of 9 micrograms per cubic meter, but found that that could prevent up to 12,500 premature deaths a year when implemented. So we're talking about a major reduction in premature death from strengthening that standard. So again, current annual limit is 8 micrograms per cubic meter. The Lung Association the current annual limit is 12 micrograms per cubic meter. The American Lung Association is recommending 8. I think that the most important part of this message today is that it needs to be stronger than what it currently is. I also mentioned the 24-hour limit. So this is a little bit higher because this covers how much particle pollution can spike on any given day. We also have some evidence, including studies that show adults over age 65 having premature deaths and other health impacts that occur at levels that would currently be deemed safe under the standard of 35. So we're also calling for a more protective standard for the 24-hour limit as well. So that's my quick overview of health impacts of PM, vulnerable populations, where we are in the country in terms of cleaning up particle pollution, and where we are in the process with EPA. I know this is a lot of information in a short time, so I look forward to answering your questions. I'll also say that I'm more than happy to connect with folks after this webinar to talk further. Thanks so much, and with that, I'll turn it back to Kara.
Thank you so much, Laura Kate, for that overview. That was extremely helpful to set us up to delve a bit deeper into how you can make your voice heard as nurses. So just give me just a couple seconds to transition to a couple slides. And a reminder that you can enter any questions you have in the chat box at any time during the presentations, and then at the end we will open it up for questions. And I apologize, just one more minute here. Okay, great. So as Laura Kate was mentioning, there in instances where EPA makes decisions, such as the proposal to retain the NACs for PM, there's opportunity for public comment. And in this instance, there's two opportunities for nurses to make their voice heard. So the first is at a virtual hearing, and this is, typically EPA has these meetings in person. Sometimes they are in different parts of the country, but for the most part, they're held in DC, which can be a bit restrictive for nurses across the country to be able to come and provide testimony in person. But because of the time that we're in gathering together is not safe, EPA is doing a virtual public meeting, so via teleconference. And the hearing is was originally it's taking place on May 20th and 21st. They have now opened it up for an additional date on the 22nd, since there has been such a response to people wanting to present comments at this hearing, that all the slots on the 20th and 21st are full right now. But don't fret, there is still an opportunity for you to sign up. And so you can visit this link here, this bit.ly link, and that will take you to the page where you can sign up to register for a time slot. So they do have session in the morning and a session in the afternoon. You can indicate which time that you would like to speak at. What happens when you do indicate which time slot you're available, that's not your confirmed time quite yet. EPA will send you an email confirming that time. And that might take a day or two, so don't worry if it's delayed. It just takes them some time to confirm the time slots. And you do need to register in advance to provide oral testimony. And you also need to, if you don't want to provide oral testimony, but you want to listen in on the hearing, they're also asking you to register in advance. And because they have added the new date on Friday the 22nd, that they have extended the deadline to register to 5/20. So there's still time for you to register. Typically when EPA holds a hearing in person, they do try to accommodate walk-ins. However, with the virtual format, it's unclear how they will be able to do that. So I strongly encourage you that if you want to present any testimony, that you register in advance to make sure you get the slot that you'd like to speak at. If you don't want to present oral testimony, but you still want to submit comments on the proposal, you can submit written comments via regulations.gov. So you can follow that bit.ly link, and that will show you how to submit comments. And note that the deadline to submit written comments is June 29th. So just some tips for providing oral testimony at the virtual hearing. So as I said, I mentioned that EPA will send you an email confirming your time slot for the day. And each registrant will have 5 minutes to present oral testimony to the EPA panel. And what this EPA panel is typically in person, I assume it'll be similar for virtual, but it could always be different. It'll usually be about 3 to 4 EPA staff members that are listening to the comments. They are asking you to join early. They're going to try their best to stay on time, but they want people to be prepared for the hearing to be running ahead or behind schedule. It's also important that you stick to the 5-minute time restriction. EPA is typically very strict with this time limit because they have a lot of people who are speaking and they want to make sure they're able to hear from everyone. So in person, they'll have, a timer or a little light that goes off when your time runs out, and then they'll actually cut you off if you're going over. And I'm not sure how the process will work over the phone, but I assume it might actually be a bit easier to cut people off. So just make sure, a tip to make sure you're within that 5-minute time frame is actually practicing speaking your comments and timing yourself, so you can ensure that you get all your important points in, but you're still speaking slowly and clearly and not rushing through your comments. And just to note that you don't have to feel like you have to say everything in your oral comments. You can provide oral comments, and then you can submit written comments that go into much greater detail. That's always an option. When you're presenting your testimony, it's helpful to introduce yourself, to say where you're from, state that you're a nurse, and give your position on whether you're supporting or opposing the decision. It's also really helpful if you can personalize your testimony. You don't have to feel like you're an air expert and provide really technical details in your comments. what sometimes is more impactful is really providing how the issue is impacting you personally or impacting your community, or even, for example, how you're seeing health impacts from air pollution on your patients and those you care for. And as I mentioned, you want to make sure you're not cramming everything in, so it's helpful to stick to a few key points. And just to know, EPA may ask questions, although I do see this rarely. It's usually if they ask questions, it's to clarify maybe a technical point someone has made, but I very rarely see them ask this of health professionals or the regular everyday citizen who's just coming to present their viewpoints. It's also important that you want to back up your comments with data if you are saying something factual or technical. In your oral testimony, you don't necessarily have to have the citations because you're presenting it, but in your written comments, you want to make sure that you include those citations so that if EPA wants to actually go and refer back to that study, it's helpful for them to have the citation there. And do note that the oral comments that are presented at the virtual hearing are transcribed and they're put in the public record. But it can be helpful for you to type up what you are planning to say and then to submit that via regulations.gov. And do note that oral and written comments are weighted the same. Doing one over the other is not better. It's just whatever you feel comfortable with your advocacy. And then I just want to also mention, for those who are either signed up to speak or who are interested in signing up to speak, I'm going to pop my email in the chat box. Please send me a note because we are tracking health voices who are providing oral comments, and we want to make sure we capture you in that list. And we're also, if you are interested in being listed as willing to speak to the media, we can also indicate that. So just let me know. We're also going to be sending around, for those who indicate that they do want to provide oral testimony or written comments, we do have some talking points that we can circulate to help you in crafting your comments. We do ask that you don't share these publicly. These are just more so to help you, help guide you in the process. And note that there is a lot of information in these talking points, and that's really meant so that you can kind of pick what speaks to you, because you're not going to have enough time in your 5 minutes to speak to all of those points. So it's just to give you a variety of options to choose from. And then lastly, another reason to let me know that you're going to be speaking is so we could also amplify this on social media. If you want to, the day before, send any of your what you're going to be speaking on, your comments that you're going to be presenting at the hearing, we can actually post that on social media so we can amplify the comments from the health voices and be able to really show strong support from nurses, and support of strengthening the standards. So with that, I'm going to pause and we'll do some questions. So we can do a couple things. So for those of you who are on the computer, we have the opportunity for you to be able to speak your question, but then you could also type it in the chat box. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to actually unmute Barbara Statler so she can ask her question here.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Yeah, so we have a nurse researcher who studies particulate matter in indoor air pollution, and it is her hypothesis that COVID could actually be present on particulate matter, and that could be another way that of transmission. And I'm wondering if there's any data on this, if anybody has seen anything with regard to any science about that.
I can say from lungs perspective, definitely too early to tell, of course. I remember reading one, I think it was out of the UK, a study that suggested the same conclusion. I don't think we've dug into it yet, so it's hard for me to speak to their methodology. But I think it's certainly reasonable for her to highlight her research and her comments.
Okay, that's really helpful because people, we could just say that we should better understand it at the very least.
Absolutely. And with regard to COVID, we have known for a long time that air pollution increases susceptibility to lung infection, separate from specifics around COVID-19. And there are, of course, early studies that show that, I think the key one is, from Harvard University, that long-term exposure to PM can correlate with increases in the COVID-19 death rate. So there is some early emerging evidence in that, again, while it's early to say that, and that study is not peer reviewed yet, it certainly is consistent with what we know about health impacts of PM.
Yeah, there's a European study too, I think in the Netherlands, that showed increased mortality associated with people who live in areas with higher air pollution. Mortality from COVID, sorry, specifically. So my other question was, and this is more towards the Annie folks, so to speak, is, or anybody, um, should we, to any extent, do coordination of our, meaning Annie member testimony, so that um, some of us could go into more depth in one area than the other? Is that desirable? And Kara and Katie, are you also testifying?
Yes, so Katie and I are signed up to testify. I believe we're both on the 21st. And we actually have, I see a couple people have entered that they also have a speaking slot. So that's amazing. And we have about six or seven Annie nurses already signed up. So we can certainly, what I think would be helpful is doing a connecting email with all of those that have signed up, so we can kind of delve deeper into seeing if we would be able to coordinate our testimony like that. And that's one thing with the talking points I find very helpful is that you can kind of pick what you can speak to in terms of your expertise. So I think that going through that too will be helpful as well. And I do see a couple questions from Claire and Paula about a general letter, and those talking points really do a very nice job of running through how you formulate your comments, because you do want to make sure that you have kind of your own personal tone to them, such saying who you are, where you're from, that you're a nurse. You don't have to say your employer, because I know that can sometimes get a bit sticky, but you can, generally say I'm a public health nurse, or I'm a nurse faculty or something like that, very general, but just showing a bit of your expertise behind it. And then just kind of sharing your personal experience or any of your research or something like that is very helpful. I do see a comment from Mira, and I actually think it would be helpful. And Mira, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm gonna unmute you and see if you might want to kind of just say that comment again to Laura Kate, because I think she might be able to talk a bit more in depth about that. Oh, and Mira, you might have to unmute yourself because I see you're on the phone. Okay, that might not be working. So let me just ask your comment, and then if we are able to hear you, we'll turn it back over to you. But what Mira is saying, she said this isn't really a question, but more just a comment, is one of the challenges I've had is linking particulate matter related to diesel trucks manufacturing plants to adverse health outcomes for the community-based organization I work with, which is Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, and they're in Chicago, Illinois. Is that there is not a ton of current local data. So speaking specifically to the Illinois EPA, I feel like the lack of local data fails to drive the so what point home.
It is a good point, and particularly, I can definitely say that, for example, our state of the air report, it doesn't tie particulate matter measurements to sources. It's a broad look at levels across the country. And so while we're usually able to say in our outreach, we know that this is a local source, it's not the same thing as having hard and fast data that connects health outcomes to that source. I'll say the nice thing here is that because, it's a nationwide limit, and we're trying to get EPA to set a more protective standard that they can then flow out to the states actually having to comply with it. But, the broader data is what they're basing this on, as opposed to the local information that is often lacking, tying particular sources to health outcomes.
Thank you, Laura Kate, for fielding that question. I'm going to unmute Carol Lindsay here. She has a question. So just one moment. And just noting, Barbara has been adding some links to some of these studies with the association with COVID and air pollution. And I will be able to pull these links from the chat, and I can send them around to those of you all who are on the webinar, as well as those who have registered. So you'll all have access to that. So Carol, you are unmuted, so feel free to ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to see if the speaker could comment on the health effects of sugarcane burning. I'm in Florida, and some of our environmental associations were trying to get them to switch to green harvesting. So I was wondering if you had any information regarding that. Thank you.
Of course. I don't have specific information on sugarcane burning offhand. I do have lots of resources from lung about how combustion in general is harmful to lung health impacts. But let me double check with some colleagues and see if there's anything specific I can provide.
Okay, thank you very much.
And if Kara would be willing to link us up, that would be great.
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then I wonder if it might, because I know that I don't see, the PowerPoint will be shared. Will the PowerPoint be shared? I'll follow up with Laura Kate and see if we can share that. And if so, we'll set it up with the video.
Yep, it's no problem with me. Feel free.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. And since we don't have any more questions, and I wonder if it might be helpful if a couple people who have provided oral testimony in a public hearing setting might be willing to share a bit about their experience, because I know this can be something that seems a bit intimidating. But actually, once you do it a time or two, you realize that it's a lot easier than you think. But just kind of getting over that initial barrier can be an obstacle. So, Barb, you're unmuted, so I don't know if you might want to share your experience, or Laura Kate, feel free to jump in too, because you are a longtime advocate.
Sure. Well, I think that what makes this quite a bit different is that oftentimes you don't want to just read your testimony, and some people do. So it is possible for you to read it here, but if you practice reading a bunch of times, then you can actually probably read with a voice inflection that sounds a lot more like you're just speaking naturally. So I think this is a nice sort of transition to speaking live, with your testimony. So I'd really encourage people to realize that this is a really kind of safe way because you can stay on your own script, and the more you practice it, the more it'll just sound like you're speaking it.
And I can't reiterate enough how important it is to practice it, because sometimes when you write testimony, when you actually go to speak it, it's not how you would speak normally, and so that is helpful, trying it out and seeing how it flows with kind of your tone and style of speaking, and it comes off a little less awkward kind of thing. So really encourage practicing.
And practice with a person if that's possible. I mean, you could call a friend and practice over the phone with them. So, especially if this is your first time doing anything like this, but I think you will be great. Any of you who are doing it for the first time.
Is there anyone else who might want to ask a question or have anything to share, maybe about their experience with this type of advocacy? It's always really great to be able to share tips and pointers with others, or even if you just want to share maybe some of your um, anxieties relating to doing something like this. Certainly open to having a conversation around this. Right. Well, I'm not hearing anything additional. So, what I might ask is, I don't know if Laura Kate, you have any last minute comments you'd like to share, or Barbara or anyone else. Oh, Adelita, I'm so sorry. Adelita, I'm gonna try to promote you to presenter here.
And I did think of one more thought after she does.
Okay, perfect. Oh, Adelita, we might be having trouble hearing you. You might have to unmute yourself on your phone. And if that's not working, then I'm just going to have you enter your comment in the chat. I'm sorry about that. So maybe, Adelita, well, since we're having trouble hearing you, would you mind entering your comment in the chat, and then we'll have Laura Kate provide her comment that she was gonna say, and then we'll come back to your comment, if that's okay.
Sure, thanks. Oh, this is Laura Kate. I've been to a bunch of these hearings in person. I've always been consistently impressed by how attentive EPA is. It's a table full of staff there taking diligent notes, listening to every presenter. And it's important not only because they, genuinely are seeking feedback and care, but also because the law requires the EPA respond to commenters. So not directly, but in their final rule, they justify if they followed comments or if they didn't, and to put a broad explanation as to the type of feedback they received and how they're addressing it. So I think it'll be a little bit harder to see that attentiveness because we'll all be on the phone next week. But I do think, based on my experience, that they will listen to each and every one of you, and so the time that you're spending will be really valuable.
And can I just add something to that, which this is Barbara, which is that a lot of the staff at EPA really believes in regulation and really believes we need to have the strictest regulation as possible. That certainly isn't reflected by, some of the political appointees, but they will be really happy that we will be doing this. And I don't know whether, Lauren, you'd like to support what I just said, but so many of the people at EPA are really terrific.
I do. I wholly support it. It is, and I think it's so helpful for the staff to hear that there are folks on the side like you who are willing to put in the time to speak to the concerns that they might not be able to raise.
Yeah, exactly. It's a hard time to be an employee at EPA.
And we have Claire who put in a comment. I presented to my U.S. rep and his staff on climate change activities, and it was a lot easier than I thought it would be. I did prepare my talking points, and thank you, Claire, for lifting that up. I think that's a very common thing, and I know that's how I felt when I first started doing advocacy work. It was a little bit intimidating, and I think that's very common for nurses and other health professionals because we get very comfortable with what we know how to do, which is caring for patients and communities and whatnot. But this is using our voices in this way is so important because even though we aren't experts in all the technical information and maybe we aren't the researchers, we are experts in how the things we see in our patients and how these policies and regulations impact the people we are caring for. So being able to share that perspective is so valuable. Oh, and she said they did really listen, especially when I shared I was a school nurse.
Excellent.
And so I apologize that we weren't, Adelita, we weren't able to get your comments. I think she's having trouble hearing us. So I'm going to follow up with her. And if it was a comment for Laura Kate, I'll get you two connected. And if it was a comment for the group, I'll make sure that it's shared in the email. So I'm sorry for that technical issue. But I wanted to, Sarah says, I wonder if there are consistent talking points data we can use, especially in relation to how these regulatory changes will impact increased racial inequity. That's a really good point. And Laura Kate, perhaps you want to take the first stab and I can follow up.
Sure. I'm happy to share the link to the section in our State of the Air report on disparities and the impact of air pollution. I think our top line message here is often that, this year is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Air. We've made enormous progress as a country in reducing air pollution, but far too many communities are still waiting for the promise of clean air to breathe. And unfortunately, there are some clear patterns that disproportionate impacts. I think, implementing and enforcing the Clean Air Act is critical. While I don't have specific data on how it could exacerbate existing disparities, I think it's pretty clear to see that, the communities that are still waiting for cleanup of their polluting sources of particle pollution are often the same ones that are dealing with disproportionate COVID impacts, disproportionate climate impacts. So I'll be happy to share the link, but I'm also happy to chat further.
That's important.
And to add to that, I think in terms of nursing, we often care for those who are most impacted by some of these issues, and that includes those who are disproportionately impacted. And so I think it's always very important to uplift the health inequities that we do see in practice, just in terms of it being, part of our ethical obligation in addressing health, but also helping to ensure that the communities that are most impacted are really being protective in ways so that they have, the ability to achieve optimal health outcomes like the rest of people in the country. And Laura Kay popped in a link here, and I'll make sure to circulate that as well. Okay, any final comments or questions before we close out here? And we'll make sure to send around the recording and the links in the chat, as well as talking points for those of you who are planning to submit comments or testify.
This was really helpful, Kara. Thanks for pulling it together.
Of course, and thank you all for joining. And if you haven't, I said I was going to pop my email in the chat, and I never did that. so let me do that right now. If you have any questions at all, please reach out to me. And again, reach out to me if you have signed up to testify, or you're going to submit written comments, because I'm happy to help you through the process if needed, and answer any additional questions that may come up for you even after this webinar. And I just want to give another thanks to Laura Kate from the American Lung Association for being here with us today. It is helpful to have her expert voice here to share her perspective, as well as her expertise on participating in advocacy such as this. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much to all of you for volunteering your time to do this.
Okay, everyone. So with that, I'm going to close the webinar, but look out for an email from me likely tomorrow with more information. Thanks, everyone.
Bye now. Take good care.